Welcome back to Dentro La Storia. Once again, happy 2026 from me and Giovanni. Now, let's go straight to new exclusive content we've prepared for you. It's a story that's not directly focused on a war event, a particular character, or a specific incident to learn about. Rather, it's a retrospective on something related. As you may have guessed from the sea theme background, today we'll examine a term that's become part of everyday language. Because how many times have you heard someone say, or maybe you've read in some newspaper, the term battleship? In a figurative or rhetorical sense, when it's used to describe a large company or a successful sports team, it's a way of talking about invincibility. Because if we talk about a battleship in the economic field, we're referring to a large conglomerate, a multinational, a financial enterprise, or a huge bank, something that's too big a bite for any competitor, something that's hard to beat in competition. But why do we say that? And what exactly were battleships? So, in this video, let's try to shed some light by digging into our past, just to understand why ships that have basically disappeared today. Battleships or warships have remained in our collective language, in our imagination, leaving something behind that is truly powerful, much more than their armor, much more than their weapons. If battleships were the queens of the seas, at least that's how they were defined, they could guarantee security to the fleets. If you want to see a battleship today, you have to go to a museum. They are floating museums, ships that survived various wars and have been preserved today as museums. Think of the United States ship Texas, which was recently restored and made available to the public again. We've already talked about Moon in a dedicated video, the United States ship Missouri, the ship on which Japan's surrender was signed. That marked the end of World War II. Or think of the Mikasa in Japan, the last surviving large multi-caliber battleship, although actually the Mikasa is not original. It's a reconstruction made with parts from other ships that were recovered. Or think of the Yorgos Averov, which is more of an armored cruiser, by the way, of Italian construction, which is still today the pride of the Hellenic Navy. Although officially a museum ship, it still always flies the flag of the Greek Navy. These ships did not have a very long history, because the history of battleships began in the mid-1800s, when wooden sailing ships powered by natural means were gradually joined and then surpassed by ships of a new design. Officially, the first battleship was a French one, the Gloire. It's called a battleship that was put into service in 1860, and it's basically a wooden sailing ship but protected by heavy steel armor. Its role was twofold. Obviously to make use of its artillery, but also to engage enemy warships and withstand their fire, precisely thanks to its armor. It's a major innovation destined to make history, and it's not the only one. Just think that a few years later, during the American Civil War, both the Unionists and the Confederates deployed new weapons. And it can be safely said that the Civil War, or the American Civil War, whatever you want to call it, was essentially the testing ground for a new way of waging war, a war based on technological progress. We begin to see new weapons, machine guns, the first modern rifles, rifled cannons replacing smoothbores, and these new ships. The Union Navy deploys the United States Ship Monitor, a name that would go on to give its name to a new class of ships, the so-called monitors. Small ships with definitely poor nautical qualities, certainly not high, not ships for the open sea, but they managed to inflict heavy losses on the enemy, thanks to the use of rotating turrets armed with powerful cannons. Ships will later be assigned to coastal defense, operations in marshy areas, or support for the infantry. Ships with short lifespans, by the start of the Second World War, less than 80 years later, their numbers will be greatly reduced. Basically, only England, for defensive reasons, and partially the Italian Royal Navy will keep some of them in service. But there aren't only monitors. The Confederate Navy, for example, literally cuts ships down to the waterline and rebuilds them as ironclad rams, with low structures made of plates and heavily armed. If we want to think about the union of the two philosophies, the Monitor based on rotating turrets and the Confederate one based on ironclad rams, the synthesis of these two philosophies gives birth to the modern battleship. The modern battleship is a different ship that surpasses the steam-powered warships, the ships that will also be seen at Lissa. In 1866, the terrible defeat of the still very young Royal Italian Navy against the Austro-Hungarian Navy. But little by little, technological development becomes unstoppable, so much so that by the end of the 19th century, most European navies, and not only them, began to equip themselves with ships, no longer made of wood but designed in iron with various grades of steel, equipped with rotating turrets, though initially with different calibers, and powered by coal-fired boilers. Warfare at sea has changed. It has changed a lot. Naval warfare is always idealized as great fleets facing each other in broadsides, but now from ever greater distances. Just think that in 1870, Great Britain launched the Devastation class, which were still steamships but without sails. The masts were kept just in case of extreme need. If the engine rooms broke down, sails could still be mounted. But these Devastation-class ships with cannons mounted in turrets set the standard. It's the so-called Fred Dreadnought, actually a term that would come much later, let's say around 1870. It would take almost 40 years to get that definition. But these are ships that usually have two main gun turrets, one at the bow and one at the stern, with other smaller caliber turrets. But they always act as a main battery arranged along the hull. It's a layout that will be maintained until the early 20th century, and practically all the navies in the world adapt to this construction. Italy launches the Duilio, which shouldn't be confused with the other Duilio of the Doria class that will come later, which will be a dreadnought, a small but very powerful ship with two armed turrets, with very high caliber cannons. In the end, however, they opt for a main battery made up of cannons ranging from 203 mm to 305 mm. With intermediate calibers, some use the 280, some the 256, but basically these are the calibers. The real further revolution, because it is a revolutionary evolution if you accept the play on words. It arrives in the 20th century, marked by the naval battle of Tsushima. It's 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. Japan, aspiring to become a great power, attacks Russia, bombs Port Arthur, and after a year of war, manages to get what it wants. Moreover, it gains not only territorial conquest, but above all, the role and recognition of a great power. And it does so on land, at Mukden, and at sea, at Tsushima, with Admiral Togo's great victory at Tsushima. It was based on greater knowledge of the sea, especially the Strait of Tsushima. Yes, on the unpreparedness, on the serious mistakes made by the Imperial Russian Navy, which deployed the Baltic Fleet, whose ships were not suited for tropical seas and were exhausted by a very long voyage to reach the site of the battle. In addition, for the design of some ships and their armor, following a scheme called bell-shaped, which was a French-style design that involved wrapping the hull with increasingly thicker armor, but during sharper maneuvers, they risked capsizing the ships. In reality, Japanese victory is determined by large caliber guns. From there, a second insight develops, and it's from an Italian, Vittorio Cuniberti, who understands the importance of large caliber guns. The Kingdom of Italy at that time already has naval research and shipbuilding, but it doesn't have the necessary financial resources to support Cuniberti's projects. He does something very simple. He writes a report that is published as an article in an English magazine. That magazine, read and aimed especially at the world of international navies, sparks interest. Right within the Royal Navy, which takes inspiration and builds the Dreadnought, the first single-caliber armored battleship. What does it mean compared to the past when the main batteries of battleships were divided among various calibers, with the problem for the fire directors of actually determining what the range was and which shots hit the target. They decided to build an all-main guns ship. Only the main guns, all with a 305mm battery, always in rotating turrets arranged along the hull. The revolution of the Dreadnought made all the other ships suddenly become obsolete with the appearance of the Dreadnought. All the other navies in the world reacted furiously, ordering new ships, as if the ones they had suddenly became useless. Great Britain spurred the arms race of Imperial Germany, and this naval arms race would be one of the causes of the Great War, the First World War. The French revised their theories, and the Italians begin to introduce new regulations, like the triple turrets that appear on the Dante Alighieri, the first Italian dreadnought, a class that, among other things, inspires, through its designs that are shared, the Tsarist Navy, which will build two classes, first the Gungut and then the Imperatrice Maria, both based on the design of the Dante Alighieri. Shipbuilding, among other things, becomes not only a reason for the arms race, but also for business. You can see this during the South American crisis involving Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. It's something we already talked about a year ago in the video about the Whip Revolt. You can find it on the channel. Rival great powers and aspiring ones in South America also face off at sea. Chile orders 2 battleships from British shipyards, and Brazil does the same, even ordering a third one, but later decides not to take delivery of it. This one will be sold to Turkey first, then taken over by the Royal Navy. Argentina launches an international tender for the construction of what will become the Rivadavia class, still dreadnoughts, still all big gun ships. English, French, Italian, and American companies take part in that tender. In the end, the Americans win the contract. But this shows how battleships become not only the backbone of fleets, but also a matter of business. With the Battle of Jutland, we're in 1916, right in the middle of the Great War. The first major surface engagement between battle fleets takes place, in which the lack of substance in Admiral Fisher's theory is highlighted. He claimed that speed was equivalent to armor, and that therefore the British battle cruisers, which were lightly armored but very fast, could make up for their lack of protection with greater speed. It also shows that the main fleets play an important role, both at sea and in the concept known as the fleet in being, a powerful fleet anchored in the ports, which serves as a deterrent, because at any moment it could leave the port and carry out a raid in open sea. But after Jutland, after the Great War, something changes. In fact, 2 things change. The first change concerns the Washington Naval Conference of 1922, which aimed to put a stop to what had been an excessive arms race, the major powers. Agreeing to set limits and proportions is something not everyone likes, as it acknowledges aspirations for power. The United States, which achieves naval parity with England, and Japan, which gains the role of the third world power and the dominant force in the Pacific. Italy, which achieves naval parity with France and imposes limits on someone else, namely France, which finds itself being regarded on the same level as a young power like Italy. And Italy, for its part, doesn't have a colonial empire vast enough to justify it, a powerful fleet to guarantee the safety of trade routes. The other big innovation is the rise of air power. It's something new. The airplane was invented in Kitty Hawk in 1903, and by 1911, Italy tested it as a weapon of war. In Libya, at the end of the Great War, the first experiments before landing took place. So, airplanes landing on ships, and then the creation of a new class, the aircraft carrier, something that at first is extremely experimental. In fact, they used modified ship hulls, ships that were about to be decommissioned, ships that were not rebuilt according to their original design, for example, battle cruisers. Gradually, aircraft carriers became crucial, especially in the doctrine of the 3 largest navies, England and the United States. In Japan, the role of the aircraft carrier will become clear in terms of sea domination during World War II. This can be seen in several instances, such as at Punta Stilo, July 1940. The presence of an English aircraft carrier in the first real clash between the Royal Navy and the Mediterranean Fleet. It's an element that hadn't been taken into account, but you can see that the coordination between the two branches, the naval and the air naval, is extremely important, also because Italy has it with coordination. A few months pass and it's November, the night of Taranto. We've discussed this in another video available on the channel. The Italian Pearl Harbor is the dress rehearsal for what would happen at Pearl Harbor just over a year later. But there are many cases we'll see midway later. June 1942. An air-naval battle won by aircraft carriers without the respective fleets ever coming into contact. From that moment on, the role of the battleship is definitively marked. But be careful. Several naval battles and large surface ships will continue to exist. We've told you about some of them. The night of the battleships at Guadalcanal, or the Battle of Bear Island on Boxing Day in 1943, with the sinking of the Charlest, the battleship. With all due respect to those admirals who still believed in its power and its role on the seas, its fate was sealed. Just think that at the outbreak of World War II in Japan, one of the countries, despite a strong naval aviation tradition, there was the so-called battleship clique. There was a group of admirals who were still pushing for the development and use of these large battleships. They were proven wrong by the facts as naval aviation became the future, a future that continues today. And the battleships. Can you believe that the last battleship launched was British? The Vanguard entered service after World War II had just ended in 1946. It's a ship that is revolutionary in some ways because it uses old recycled cannons, but inside a structure that includes the use of computers for calculating range. It's something that could be reused in the future with technological advancements and the introduction of missile systems. Today, warships use missiles more than artillery, but the fate of battleships is sealed. Little by little, they are put into reserve, dismantled, reduced to scrap, and some are even used as targets for atomic tests. An ERA ends the period between the 1960s and 1970s, saw the retirement of the last ships, Richelieu and Jean Bart. We have already discussed this. The very last one is the Goeben, or, if you prefer the Turkish name, the Yavuz, a battlecruiser built by the Imperial German Navy. It entered service shortly before the outbreak of the Great War, and was handed over by the Germans to the Ottoman Empire. And it remained in service until the late 1950s, then stayed in reserve and was eventually scrapped in the 1970s after an unsuccessful attempt by Turkey to sell it back to West Germany. Actually, something did survive. As museum ships, but also with the attempt to use these large ships, which are formidable at taking hits as well as being heavily armed platforms, with other roles from the late 1960s Vietnam War era to the 1980s presidency. The United States Navy decided to modernize and reuse the class ships. Iowa, the 4 GREAT battleships, the last 4 great battleships of the United States Navy, very powerful ships, well-protected ships, exceptionally armed, capable of many operations. The same Iowa class is partially rebuilt because some of its secondary artillery is replaced by advanced defense systems, and Tomahawk launch systems are also installed on board. It's the latest evolution, but it's basically bringing fascinating, enormous, beautiful dinosaurs back to sail the seas. After the Kuwait War, in the early 1990s, these last great ships returned home to their ports to become museums. And this is still true today. You can visit them, you can see them, you can go on board, you can observe and experience firsthand the cramped spaces inside. The artillery towers, the command tower. You can see how people lived on board and imagine a not-so-distant past that's now gone. We no longer discuss battleships or warships. Even cruisers themselves have now been reduced to a minor role compared to the past. And even the great fleets are relying on them less and less. Carrier-based aviation and missiles now play the main role. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and multi-role frigates are used. Warfare at sea has evolved rapidly, especially in the last 2 centuries. And we must remember how recent this transformation is. It has become faster and faster, eventually developing extremely sophisticated weapons. And in a short time, it has set aside even what until recently seemed advanced and cutting edge. Today, the name battleship remains, which we use figuratively when referring to a major sports team, a multinational, or a company. Success, because they are hard to attack, because they are considered unsinkable, because they have great power in the sports field or in the financial market. So you react whenever you hear battleship, even if it means a bank or a soccer team? Maybe a smile could appear on your faces when you think back to this video and remember the images of the great ships we showed you. Who knows, maybe sometimes when you see one of these teams take the field or read the financial news, you'll wonder, who knows? That bank is like the United States ship Iowa. That team is like the firepower of the Italian Vittorio Veneto. Another one is elegant, like the Bismarck. But these are just remnants of a past that is a bit nostalgic, but which in fact is gone and, unfortunately, has very little to do with the present.